Hello, everyone. Everyone trickling in, welcome today. We're so excited to talk about building a culture of collaboration in math. But before we get started, let's just I want you to throw your titles and where you're from in the chat while we wait for everyone else to join us. I want to see who's joining us today. North Carolina. I am in Huntersville, North Carolina. Don't know if you're close to that, Stephanie, but yay, North Carolina. There's everyone. Everyone joining the chat now. Lots of middle school math people. Another North Carolinian, nice. All right, everyone, while we wait for people to join, about 4:01, I will go ahead and go over some housekeeping for today. So if you'd like to access closed captioning, please hit the CC button in the bottom tray and then show subtitles, and you'll get a transcript of everything that's happening as it happens. If you can participate and make comments at any time via the chat, but we'll also have a dedicated Q&A at the end of the webinar, so you can submit questions using the Q&A function. And that's the best way to make sure that we get all your questions and we see them and save them for the end. You will also receive a certificate and webinar recording via Zoom after the webinar ends, either today or tomorrow. You should get that email. And then we'll also send another follow-up just to make sure you got the recording. So go ahead and introduce our wonderful speaker today. So Kristin Gray is here with us. She's the executive director of the Math Suite at Amplify. We're so happy she's here. You may have seen her on a couple other webinars we've had or sessions at different conferences. She previously served as the director of K-5 curriculum and professional learning at Illustrative Mathematics. And she's been teaching for a while, 22-year veteran teacher and coach of grades K-8. So we love having her here. She's definitely seen it all. And with that, Kristin, I'll kick it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Shannon. And thank you all so much for being here with me. I think, Shannon, yep, you unshare. I can start to share mine. This topic today is one that is near and dear to my heart. As Shannon mentioned, I taught and coached for 22 years. And as part of my role in Amplify, I am in schools 2 days a week working with teachers. And so in my work with teachers, we plan for lessons together, we teach them together, and then we come back and we reflect on the experience. How did our planning reflect in what happened in the classroom? And as you can imagine, all of our conversations and every aspect of this cycle is really focused on students, how they're engaging in the mathematics, and more importantly, how are they collaborating and working with one another during those times? So I want to spend a lot of time talking today about student collaboration. What are elements of it? Why is it important? But I also want to spend a little bit of time talking about structures for teacher collaboration, because I think that is equally as important when we think about how we want students engaging in mathematics. We can transfer that to how we want teachers engaging in teaching and planning with one another. So our big questions for today: why is collaboration important? How can we support student collaboration? And then how can we support educator collaboration? And I know Shannon mentioned, but I just want to reiterate, please put any thoughts and comments in the chat and the Q&A, and so we can have some things to talk about at the end and make sure you leave with all of your questions and wonderings answered. All right, so why is collaboration important? And like in our classrooms, I want to start by connecting to your prior experiences and understandings that you have. So I want you to picture a classroom that is highly collaborative. And in the chat, I would just love for you to drop in, what are you seeing in this classroom to indicate that it's highly collaborative? What are you hearing in the classroom? And what are students working on? So I'm just going to give you a minute or two in the chat to drop some things you're thinking. So just picture any classroom that's highly collaborative. What are you seeing, hearing, and what are they working on? I love this. Tables, not desks. So we're talking about settings, students discussing ideas, planning together. The students are planning projects together, talking about strategies. Problem-based learning would be helpful in collaboration. I couldn't agree more, Caitlin. Talking about problems and problem solving, group work, iterations of thinking, like that a lot. Tables, problem solving, explaining their thinking, guiding questions, animated conversations, always justifying their answers, discussing and debating, group work. Oh, all of these are so good. And I think, as evidenced by our chat and our experiences, collaboration sometimes can get bucketed into kids are talking. But as we can see here by all of the ideas in the chat, which is everything from they should be in tables, not isolated desks, and the type of structures that they're using and the questions that they're answering, the vocabulary that they're using, and the justifying of their reasoning, all of those are so much larger than simply students talking to one another. So we want to think a lot about collaboration in the broader sense of what it means to be a highly collaborative classroom. And so let me get that chat going. So why collaborate? Collaboration to me is more than all the individual elements and really is just about making connections. So when kids are doing mathematics and collaborating with one another, we see them connecting to their own experiences. So understandings that they might be bringing with them, lived experiences from outside the school that they're bringing with them. Students are making connections between mathematical ideas. Again, prior grade mathematical ideas or within current grade concepts. That coherence and connections is extremely important as students are collaborating with one another. And they're connecting to others' ideas. And in all of these, when we think about each individual student in our classroom, experiences will be widely varied. Understandings and mathematical ideas and knowledge that they're bringing with them and questions they have about the mathematics that they're bringing with them will be widely varied. And their ideas about what it means to problem solve, how they use particular strategies in the mathematics, all of those ideas will be widely varied. So collaboration is the time and space to take all of these widely varied things that each student brings uniquely to our math classroom and bring them out in a really safe and collaborative culture in our classroom. And why is it important? I could have pulled from a ton of research, but I pulled just a few that I thought were really important and really connected to the work that we were doing. First, NCTM has talked a lot about mathematical conversations and discourse among students and how it helps build a shared understanding of the mathematical ideas. I know in the chat I saw someone had written problem-based learning, and I think that's one of the advantages of problem-based learning or learning through problem solving is you help build this shared understanding of the mathematical ideas through what students know and understand and bring to the classroom. The discourse also supports metacognition and teaches students how to discuss and debate and reevaluate mathematical situations. Again, in the chat, I saw somebody talking about drafts of student thinking or rough drafts of student thinking, and I think that is really relevant. And little plug for Mandy Jansen's book, Rough Draft Math. If you have not read it, I think it really speaks to that idea of revising ideas and refining our thinking. And then NCTM also put out that students, when they have the opportunity to work together and compare their approaches, then the hierarchy that we sometimes see in classrooms among students is diminished and all ideas are valued in the classroom. So this is why connections and collaboration is so important in the math classroom from the aspect of how students are working and learning together. And then when we think about the mathematics itself, and transferring knowledge from one setting to another. So for example, sometimes we'll see students do something in print and then they go to something on a computer, and the understandings don't transfer. Transfer is a really hard thing for students to do. It's hard for adults to do sometimes too, when you transfer between mathematical ideas or between settings. So when we have this collaboration where we have this shared understanding and this idea of how we communicate and build a deeper understanding together, it supports these type of mathematical connections that support transfer. So there's these connections between context and practices, organizing and lending core concepts to one another, and then connections between key representations. So I'm sure if you have been in the math classroom and seen students comparing different strategies, it really speaks to that last bullet. If you haven't read the paper Practicing Connections by Stigler, I think it's a really important paper that I find really interesting in thinking about how students transfer ideas from one place to another. And of course, while research is wonderful, and we always want to lean into how research can support practice in our classrooms, I find it always so insightful to ask the students that I work with as well. So in the mind of a third grader, when asked why is it important to work together in math, one said it's important to work together because you can get smarter by other people's ideas. Love that. And I think working together is important because it's more fun and you can know your friends better. And I don't want to focus so hard on the mathematics, the collaboration and the math, and lose sight of the social aspect that learning has when students are collaborating and they get to know their friends better, even within the context of learning math together. So I really loved these two ideas. And I think if we ever want the honest opinion on any question, we should always go to our students because they will tell you what they are thinking. And so I sat and I thought about, what does it mean or take for students to collaborate? What are things we should think about if we had to bullet a list of things to check off? The first thing is students need tasks worth talking about. It's hard to get a task, especially if a task is structured in a really proceduralized way. It's hard for students to have a lot of things to talk about and collaborate around. So we need to make sure that the task itself is going to be worth talking about. We need a community and structures that allow for these rough draft ideas. We want students to feel okay having an idea in progress, or if they're stuck, being able to name where they're stuck or confused. And then they need opportunities to, and this is all of the things that popped up in the chat, share their ideas, actively listen to the ideas of others, and they need a chance to connect and revise ideas. So we're going to go through aspects that address each of these things that students need as we go through. So how can we support student collaboration? The first thing that we do in the classrooms that I work with is they co-establish norms. So the teacher, the first 2 weeks of school, after doing a couple of lessons together, ask the student, what does it look and sound like to do math together? And what norms should we keep in mind as we do math together? And so this is just one example from one of the classrooms that I work in. And I think it's really interesting to see how students think about doing math together, what the students are doing, and we don't leave out what the teacher is doing. We want to, number one, especially at the beginning of the year, learn how students have experienced math. So when they describe what the students are doing and what the teacher is doing, it gives you insight into their prior experiences that they've had. And then as you go through the school year, coming back to this and revising it. So what things did we do today that we might want to revise, or which one of these norms did we do really well today that helped us get to the mathematics that we were working with? So I really loved having these community norms, and they're posted and they're revisable. It's a working version. So it's not just a set of classroom rules, but it's something that the students have come to together with the teacher, that it's revisable. It's a working document across the year. So I find this is a really great starting place. And I'm just going to, I know I'm going to talk about teacher learning at the end of this, but in working with teacher teams, I have found this is also really important to center at the very beginning of the work. I think we make assumptions that because teachers are on teams together, that collaboration is easy and just happens. But when you get into how teachers feel about the norms that they should work in, it helps everybody know how to work with one another in really clear ways. So even though this piece is about students co-developing norms, I think it's really interesting to think about teachers who work together sitting and coming up with norms of their own, of how they work together when we plan. If they're in one of those classroom, what norms should we have? So co-establishing norms is a great spot to start to create that culture where students feel safe sharing ideas and understand that's expected. And now the next part is we want to give them math work talking about. So it comes down to the task that we're giving them. I'm going to show you two tasks. I'm going to wait about 30 seconds between each, because when I show you the task, I want you to imagine what this task looks like in a classroom. What are students doing? And how is collaboration showing up in that task? So here's the first one. Students are asked to estimate the number of paper clips that would be needed to measure the outline of a shape. This paper is obviously scaled down, so the paper clips would be actually more than one or two. And then they're going to check their estimates and show or explain their thinking. I'll give you about 30 seconds to think about what you visualize students would be doing during this task. Now the second task, students are given shapes with tick marks or dots. They're asked to determine the perimeter of each shape, and the distance between the tick marks is 1 unit. So I want you to imagine now what students might be doing to determine the perimeter of each shape. All right, now in the chat, I'm going to ask you just to put one letter, task A or task B. Which one do you think, just by the nature of the task prompt, would open itself up for more student collaboration? That's a lot of A's. I could take a justification for B if you have. I think that's right. When I read these two tasks, A jumps out at me right away for being a more collaborative task just by nature of the prompt itself. And so that's not to say that B can't be, and we are going to talk about how B could turn into a more collaborative task. But some tasks, just by nature of the prompt and what students are doing, lends itself to a highly collaborative classroom. And so now, so this is the way I would imagine task A playing out, and then we'll watch a clip of some students working on this particular task. So before we gave students this task, we would provide independent work time. So I don't want to send the message that collaboration means kids are working together on everything every second of every math class. I think there are moments in time where students need to be working independently to wrap their head around tasks and just engage in it first, because it's hard to revise your own ideas if you haven't had a chance to think about your own ideas. So even when a task comes across as highly collaborative just when we read it, we don't want to ignore that students need some independent work time. So for this task, we would provide some independent work time for students to do their estimates, maybe for all of them that would be needed. That way it gives them something to talk about once we say, okay, talk at your table or talk with your elbow partner. So always give the independent work time. And this is a hint Phil Darrow gave me, which I thought was genius, and I can't believe I never had thought of it, but you want to stop students before they're finished. So even though we give independent work time, stopping them before they get done and letting them know that you're going to stop them before they get done is so critical to having something to talk about. If I have gotten through all of this and then both partners are done and I ask them to talk with one another, they're just going to, here's what I got, here's what I got, here's how I got it, here's how I got it. But there's no need to really listen and take in what the other person is saying because I'm finished. they're finished, we're just sharing. But are we really listening? And the way to encourage students to listen to one another and really take in and revise, ideas together is to stop them before they're finished. So what I might do when I hand them this task is say, I'm going to give you a minute or two to get started on estimating for each of these shapes. I'm going to stop you before you are finished and ask you to turn and work with your table to finish the rest of them together. So they don't feel like, oh no, I'm not done. And that panic that students might feel if we're moving along and they're not on the same page. So I just let them in on the secret. I'm going to stop you before you're finished, and then we're going to talk about it. And that has changed how students collaborate and just jump into conversations together. In all my years of teaching, I think I waited for most of them to get finished. And that's probably why a lot of those conversations were really hard to get them listening to one another. During the task, as a teacher, just monitoring, asking questions, and keeping track of time and energy. You want to make sure, and we all know that buzz when collaboration is really high, and we also know when we start to hear it fade out. And once that energy starts to dull, we want to not wait for it to get complete silence of nobody's talking to one another, but we know the energy in the room, and keeping that energy keeps the task going in a really productive way. And then afterwards, we want to take the students' ideas and we want to make the connections explicit between their strategies. So even though they've shared with one another as we're monitoring and asking questions, we want to make sure that we're pulling some examples of students who made different estimates, check them in different ways, maybe different recording that they did on their sheet that is really interesting. So that's how we would facilitate this task at a general structure. And this is what it looks like playing out. And as you're watching, if you want to in the chat drop moments where you see elements of collaboration based on any of the things that we said at the very first question, that would be great as well.
Right. You are correct. On this side. What?
They helpful at all? No.
I don't even understand why I did it.
Princess, why do you think it's helpful to do that?
It's like a guideline for the next paper. I got the guideline for many. It's like a guideline.
And what do you mean it's a guideline for the next paper?
So if like one is here and I mark it, like if I didn't mark it, you wouldn't know where the next paper clip would go. I think I understand what she was trying to do.
What was she trying to do?
That's how to place that.
Oh, they do.
So basically, I remember when I did on a thing where we had to use a paper clip, and I remember what me and previous did, so now I'm using this strategy.
The same strategy, and so you're just labeling this. Great. I saw a lot of wonderful things in the chat of discussing the task with one another, listening to each other, and talking about exact moments that we see collaboration. Let me get off this screen. I think where we see collaboration, I loved the idea of students being on one another's paper. So them taking turns, and I see some comments about high school students being really hard. I think that is where more structures would need to, maybe more structure would help in terms of roles. I could imagine if I was trying, and I don't think it's easier to engage K-5 students in collaboration because it is very challenging as well. I understand that a secondary might be different, but I think there is definitely, this is this was from last year, and it took all year to get students to this place. So this isn't something I don't think that just happens in the classroom. So I think it does take some structure. I could imagine something that might make it more challenging or interesting to talk about is you could say something like, I want you to, without putting your hands on the paper, write down what you think the estimate is. And then have your partner check your estimate with the actual, so you can do some structural things that will make it feel a little bit more game-like for students to collaborate, if just jumping into the task itself doesn't feel natural or doesn't feel like it naturally happens collaboratively. Another thing that I did, actually, I'll talk through this task and then I'll tell you, because that's the structure that we have for this one. So this task we set on face value does not seem like a highly collaborative task. It seems like something students would get and they would solve the problem, but it doesn't mean it can't be a highly collaborative task. So look, I see people trying to adjust it the same. I love that already. So to go through this, I have to close the chat. I'm so easily distracted, but I would do the same thing with this one. But if I wanted to open this up a little bit more, so it didn't just feel like students would dive in and be solving it independently, I might ask, what questions do you have? What does this remind you of? So I could take the directions off, show the two shapes, maybe ask them, what questions do you have? What does this remind you of? That would pull on their prior knowledge, which is something, remember, collaboration, we're always thinking about connections we can make for students. So just opening the prompt like that gives everybody an entry point into it. And during it, I would use a couple purposeful routines for structure. Turn and talks is an obvious one. So, or the think, pair, shares, whatever version of that you might like, and giving them a really specific prompt to talk about. That might be something that helps encourage the collaboration if they have a structure of a routine. Another one I like that was a great starting point at the beginning of the year to get them used to sharing and listening to one another was what's called a go round. So quick description of that. If you are in a table of 4, everybody again gets the independent work time, but we stop them before they're finished. And then we have the structure where every student in that group shares where they are in their thinking. So, and they know that there's an openness to say, and I'm stuck here because blank, whatever they're stuck on. And the other students aren't answering, they're not helping, they are just listening to one another. And then they all jump in and finish it together. So it might be student 1 goes, oh, I started by counting every tick mark, maybe is a strategy that they had that was gonna maybe wind them up in, in an incorrect answer. And another student might say, oh, I'm counting between each tick mark is 1. And then we've listened to all 4 students. Now we know that we're thinking differently because you've said something that's not a strategy I'm using. And so when we go to finish the task together, now we've got to work through how your strategy is different than my strategy, and are they going to end us at the same answer? So those types of structures. And then after you do the go rounds a few times with students, they get in the habit of how they share, how to share their strategy, how to share maybe where they're stuck. And I think those are really helpful. So more like structured routines for collaboration, I think are really helpful at the beginning. And then you can kind of loosen up on the routines once you start to see it naturally happening with students. So they are working on one another's paper, they're sharing, taking turns putting down the paper clips and writing responses. So all of that. So tasks by nature can encourage collaboration, but even if it seems like a task that is more one that they would sit and solve independently, we can use different pedagogical structures now to make the task more collaborative than it is just on the face value. Any task has that potential, and I see in the chat brainstorms of how we can make those things happen. I think that is part of the fun of teaching is making things, adapting things in ways that support students in their discussions and their learning. So for example, if we were to turn and talk, we don't want to, sometimes I find turn and talks can be very vague, or they turn and talk about nothing mathematical. So I have found it really helpful to give them the prompt that they're going to talk about. So in this particular case, how they labeled the length of each side is really important in how they think about perimeter and how they're going to eventually generalize perimeter. So I might say, turn and talk about how you labeled the length of each side, and then turn and talk about how your equation matches the labels that you have, or how does your answer match the labels that you have. So something really specific about the work that they have, not just turn and talk about how you found the perimeter, because sometimes they don't get into the meat of the mathematics if we leave it at that like higher level. So sometimes I like to be really specific at the part of their work that I want them to examine together. And the same thing about the go round, I give them really direction. I mean, the first few times we do it, it's on the board, so they see a go round, listen as each person shares, and then after everyone's gone, ask questions and finish the problem together. So it's a really structured routine. But then after you do it a couple times, you can say, okay, pause, do a quick go round, and they know the routine. And that helps just spark the discussion. So those are two structures that might help even in the secondary space if it's not feeling as easy to have students talking and to collaborate with one another. And then the connecting of ideas is something like this. So if students had solved this, you can see the interesting ideas that they have here, even between how they looped to count, how they just numbered between each one. And then the interesting thing with A is the student on the bottom here had counted the dots going around and gotten 8 and 3. So they still got the correct perimeter. Because the perimeter is, but the side lengths are 9 and 2. So when you put those up, and it's a really common error for students, and it's a great spark for conversation. So putting these strategies up and having students speak really specifically to those 3 strategies, where do they see things are similar and different, and why, help students refine their ideas and share them with one another. So being really purposeful about how we connect strategies can also help encourage collaboration, because students are working around their own ideas, which is a really powerful thing for kids. So that's student collaboration. Just a couple things that we can do. I think starting with a good problem is always really important. Having norms that we're working under is great. And then the pedagogical structures that can make collaboration come to life in your classroom are key things to think about. And now I would love to move into just a quick piece on teacher collaboration. So what does it mean for teachers to collaborate and work together? So I wanted to launch this section by, in the chat, asking you to put one word or phrase, and you can put in as many as you want, in the answer to this question. What do teachers need to know and be able to do? So in order to teach effectively or well, or whatever adjective you want to use, what do teachers need to know and be able to do? And just go ahead and drop that in the chat. Yes, flexibility, so important. Communicate, games, standards. Energy for sure. We feel that at the end of the school day. Communicate, yes, knowing what student conceptions and misconceptions that we're going to be coming up in upcoming lessons. How to adapt. Assessments I see as a part of that. Yes, and each learner's needs is so unique. And I usually do this activity when I do an in-person PD and I have Post-its on tables. So if you ever are in a room thinking about what it means to support teacher learning, I usually will have Post-its out and ask them, and one Post-it for every idea. And by the end of 3 to 4 minutes, the whole table is usually peppered with all these Post-it notes. And then we bucket them into different categories, because as you can see, just if you're reading the different ideas in the chat, the 4 buckets that usually come up when we do this activity is math content is definitely one of the things that teachers need to know and be able to leverage in their teaching. So some of these I saw assessments, and I would put some of those in the bucket of math content. Pedagogy, like teaching moves, flexibility, being adept in changing course mid-lesson if things aren't going well. So I think this flexibility piece falls under that pedagogical piece of knowing where to pivot and what to do next. Beliefs and positioning, how we think about students, understanding what they're bringing with them, how we build on what they know. Those types of things are really important. And then the 4th bucket I usually see pop up is student thinking. What are students going to do? Which is connected to content, but it's still really unique in knowing if I give them that perimeter task, what are common things students do with that task? That's really powerful in bringing to a planning session. So in thinking about your own setting, teaching, coaching, administrator, whatever it might be, how do your teams currently work together? What is the structure and purpose that they use? What's going well? What's challenging? And and I just want to focus on the last question right now. We would usually in an in-person sit and discuss these. So if you are doing this with your team at school, these questions are really good to start prompting a shift in how teachers work together. But the last one, I'd love you to drop in the chat. What of the one-word ideas do you think you focus on most when your teacher teams are working together? What area of teaching that was in that chat is the one that seems to be the one that's focused most when teachers meet? If you could drop that in the chat. Some content, some differentiation. Standards, so content, lots of content getting together. Content and data. I imagine the differentiation also might come along with the data piece as well. So we started to see the same thing also when I was teaching, excuse me, had a cold this weekend, I cannot shake. When I was teaching, our team meetings would focus on something really specific. Sometimes it was data and differentiation, or it was focus on content. But the hard part was there's so many aspects surrounding that. So knowing the content doesn't translate to what we do in the classroom around that content. Knowing how to differentiate doesn't transfer to knowing the content of each lesson that we're going to do. So all of these aspects are really unique. And sometimes when we meet together as teams, we zoom in and focus on one part of that, but it doesn't capture all of the aspects. So one thing that we've done is collaborated educators is learning labs. And learning labs is something that is really important that I'm just going to go through a quick overview, but if you Google search learning labs, you will find work on it. But we need to collaborate because teaching mathematics is complex, as we know, by all of those one word or ideas or phrases that were popped in the chat. Continual learning about the subject matter and how to make it relevant and meaningful for students. And this is the one profession where it is so dynamic. Every decision is so moment to moment because you never know it. I mean, as much as you can try to anticipate, you never know exactly what students are going to do when they get into a lesson. So being adept in those moment to moment dynamic decision making is really powerful for kids. So what we do is we start what we call a lab classroom. I had teachers sit and just do a word splash of all of the words they associate with labs. So if you just think of a lab in general, and all of the words they came up with, I just loved in thinking about teaching. We're experimenting, we're collaborating, we are predicting what students might do, it's hands-on, we're observing, it's interactive. So a lot of these words translate right to what we want to see teachers doing when they're planning and teaching with one another. So a lab classroom is not a new idea. Elham Kazemi from University of Washington does what's called math labs. And it's where teachers, teacher educators, school leaders, they are in classrooms together learning from students. So they collectively plan a lesson together, go into a classroom to observe it and come back and reflect on it. So that's the structure of math labs. It works a little bit differently, obviously, with a partnership between a college and a school than within a school building. Within the school building, there are so many more logistical constraints that make this something you're going to need to work with and massage for to make it work in your own building. And it's looked different in every building that I've done it in, but it keeps the same general structure. So in a lab classroom, we're planning together, taking a deep dive into student work. What do students know and are able to do before we plan this lesson? We talk about the math. We get into the task and talk about the mathematics, looking at the standards or progressions document. And then we plan together. We plan the lesson, or we plan sometimes just an activity. If there's one activity in a full lesson, that is the one that's most critical for students to engage in and collaborate around. That's the one we'll plan. Then the next day, we teach, co-teach together. And if this can be a team of two working together. So for example, in the schools that I work in, I plan with them on Tuesday and I teach with that teacher on Wednesday. I co-teach with them. Sometimes we switch it up where I go cover another teacher of that grade level so they can be in the classroom. So if you've got some coaches who could not be the one in the classroom, but covering so teachers can be in one another's rooms, that's really powerful. I have an amazing administrator right now who will go cover a classroom and teach the math of that lesson. So it's not covering where they're just doing behavior management. They're actually teaching the lesson that we planned together in the classroom. So it takes a lot of flexibility, like we know, and people to just be all in on trying to make this work. And sometimes it might be that once a month is when we do the official learning lab. And some schools might have a structure where the coach and teacher planning works out that they can do it once a week. So it will vary by district, but plan together, teach together, and then reflect on that together. Like I mentioned earlier, before doing any of this work, it's really important to think about teachers setting norms together. So what are norms we have when we plan together? What are norms we have when we teach or we're in one another's rooms together? And what are norms when we reflect? Specific ones that come to mind that came up that I thought were really important is it's about the student, not the teacher. So if we're in and we're in someone else's classroom, we are looking at the students. We've co-planned this lesson together. We're invested in it. It's not just one person's lesson who's up there teaching it. It is all of our lesson because we were invested in it. And then when we reflect on it, we reflect on what we might want to do differently in the next time that we have a lesson of this structure. So this is just the general structure that we use for learning labs. Again, in all of the work, we center student ideas and think about ways to structure activities. So it does increase collaboration in the classroom by using routines that we might want to have as a structure for talking, or tasks that just inherently do the collaboration just by nature of the task. So the learning labs is a wonderful structure. I've used it when I was a part of it when I taught. I moved into a coaching role and used it there in my school. Shifted a lot from what we called PLCs, which were basically data meetings that nothing instructional ever came out of that. It was just looking at data. So we made a shift to learning labs to really focus on the instruction. And when we think about data, there's no better data in planning tomorrow's lesson than what students know today. So looking at something like an exit ticket or a cool down or whatever you might have then is really, really powerful and important. I'm going to invite you to, in the chat, either drop in something that connected to what you already knew today, what new ideas extended or pushed your thinking in new directions. Oh, thinking, I put thinning. That's lovely. And what is now a challenge for you to get your mind around? And then Shannon, I think you're going to pick up and do Q&A, but while we're waiting for that, if you want to drop in the chat, something that connected, extended, or challenged your thinking.
Thank you so much, Kristin. I'm pulling up my slides now. And I was monitoring the Q&A and I did not see a lot of questions yet. So
It must have
I'm sure some will keep them now.
crystal clear. I do see a lot about learning labs in the chat, which I love. It's definitely, Katie, it's definitely difficult to enact. I think starting with a pair of teachers was a really great starting place for us. So starting with just a coach and a teacher, or if we had a classroom that had two teachers, like a team classroom, having one of them go teach with another teacher. So it takes a logistical planning for that. So, but you could definitely start small. And if you have one grade level who is really flexible in the way that their schedules work, that might be great too.
Yeah, and I just want to throw out there that we actually worked with Kristin very recently on a learning lab like starter guide. So keep an eye on your inboxes for the end of October. We'll be sharing that out and releasing that. So very something that we thought would be helpful for everyone, clearly from the chat. People are very interested still in learning labs. So
yeah, Phyllis, I agree. The open-ended questions, I started learning, the thing I think that opened my mind up to how easy it was to get a task to be more open-ended was the numberless or questionless word problems. So I would, instead of putting up a whole word problem, I would take the question off, or I would take the numbers out and just ask students to do a notice wonder to acclimate them to the context that they were working with. And those notice wonders were so rich. So I would be able to finish the lesson out to whatever the learning goal was that day. So I wouldn't leave it totally open-ended. I would just, but getting their ideas out there actually offered me a lot more, because then all their wonders that they had were things they could solve. For the kids who got done like that, which we always have that handful who's like, I'm done, right or wrong, they're done fast. But with those students, having that bank of other things that you wondered that could be answered mathematically about the problem, it was really powerful to open it up for more ideas and collaboration of bringing out. But I agree with you. I think it can be easy. The hard part is once their ideas are so good and out there, it's hard to wrangle them back and get it back to the lesson that you're doing. But I think the opening it up it makes kids want to talk about it because it's interesting. And I think that's really important.
and I don't see lots of people still throwing stuff in the chat, but I don't see any questions. And we only had one during the webinar that I saw. Oh, and of course, as I say that now, the Q&A lights up. But the one question that I saw during the webinar that I did answer is if you'll get a copy of the slides after the webinar. So you will get a Zoom recording or Zoom email with the recording of the webinar and your certificate. So that will be coming either this evening or tomorrow, whenever the recording processes. And then we'll also send you another one with the recording from our team, just to make sure you got it. And then one of the questions that we just got in Q&A, how do you design collaborative projects for high school students? I know, Kristin, you work a lot with K-5, so it'll be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, that will be, a lot of it will, I mean, I'm a big believer in curriculum, high quality curriculum materials. So I don't know if those projects can come out of something that's in the curriculum, or if the curriculum itself has those. That would be the first place that I would probably look. But if you, whatever curriculum you have, I think one way to make it not necessarily a project, but make it highly collaborative is to embed some pedagogical structures on top of it. So posing a problem or a situation, take the question off of it. Now this will be another third grade example, but for example, they were starting division, and the word problem was like Wesley had 24 granola bars he was sharing with 6 friends. How many does each get, or something like that? So I just put up the sentence of Wesley is bringing granola bars to share with his friends. What do you notice? What do you wonder? Getting their noticings, like they notice all the things they wonder are great. They're acclimating themselves to the situation, and then having them go through and answer the things that give them the information they need. So what information do you need? So it's a lot of that modeling cycle that I think is really important, especially for the high school tasks of how do you get them thinking about the situation, modeling what might happen based on different inputs, what questions, need to be answered from this. So I think that would be really key to the high school projects, but it's hard to answer that without knowing curriculum, like all of those things that play a part of our daily teaching.
And then a question, are these type of activities formative or summative?
I would think they would be formative when we think about just collaboration in nature. I think like the summative ones are not typically as collaborative. So I think when I'm thinking of them, I'm thinking of my daily lesson, which I think are formative opportunities to learn about what kids know and what questions to ask and how to nudge their thinking forward. So I would say more so formative.
All right, and then that is it. The questions we have, which is surprising, but you did such a good job that we don't want to questions.
Yes, and I see, I don't know if it's Alana, so I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing it, but giving the correct answer and solving and discuss which way is best. I think something else that I've loved doing is giving them the answer and asking them what question I answered. So for example, we're doing volume in 5th grade right now. So if they have the figure with the sides labeled, I might say 3 feet is my answer. What's my question? Length. 27 cubic feet is my answer. What's the question? Volume. So, or 3 times 7 is my question, or is my answer. What's the question? So giving them an answer, but from the same scenario or same image, whatever you have, there'll be multiple questions that they can answer based on it. So just giving them an answer and having them formulate the question is also a really fun way to engage them in making sense of a task as well.
Right, and so I will go now to our last slide. If you want more from Amplify, you can check out more free math PD opportunities. We have lots more webinars coming at amplify.com/math webinars. We have a lot of exciting K-5 stuff. If you followed us for a while, we do lean a lot towards 6-8, 6 Algebra 1 with our current resources, but we have a lot of K-5 stuff coming. So if you want to be the first to know about all that stuff, you can join our K-5 Math VIP list. There's always more tips and strategies in the Math Teacher Lounge podcast that goes across the board for like strategies for K-5, 6-8, high school, or for
Thank you, Robert.
Got me. Or strategies for teachers themselves. Listen to the Math Teacher Lounge podcast. And then we also have free resources for your math class that we released for back to school season, but they apply all year round. You can also check that out. And Robert, yes, I think a terrible cold is going around. Everyone is sick right now. It is the worst. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I know that your time is precious and more valuable than ever, so we really appreciate you coming. And thank you, Kristin. As always, this is wonderful and very, very helpful.
Yes, thank you all. And thank you, Shannon, so much. Appreciate you.
Thanks, everyone.